the silent plea. The winter wind whispered through the streets of Boston on that quiet December evening. Snow fell in gentle spirals, coating the sidewalk in a blanket of white. The city lights reflected off the fresh powder, creating a soft glow that made everything seem peaceful, almost magical. But not everyone felt that peace. James Mitchell walked slowly down Newbury Street, his 2 young daughters bundled up beside him. Sarah, age 7, skipped ahead in her pink winter coat, while Emma, just 5 years old, held tight to her father's hand. They had spent the afternoon at the Children's Museum, and now they were heading home, their breath forming little clouds in the cold air. James was a good father, everyone said so. Since his wife had passed away 2 years earlier, he had devoted every moment to his girls. He worked from home as a graphic designer, picking up whatever projects he could find. Money was tight, but love was abundant. That was what mattered. As they passed the warm glow of a small cafe, something caught James's attention. A young woman sat in a wheelchair near the shop's entrance. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a thin burgundy coat that looked like it had seen many winters. But it was her eyes that stopped James in his tracks. They held a desperate sadness, a quiet plea that seemed to reach across the snowy sidewalk. Her hands moved with careful precision, forming shapes in the air. James paused. He had taken a sign language class years ago, back in college. It had been his wife's idea. She had a deaf cousin and wanted to learn. The memories were rusty, but as he watched the young woman's hands, the meaning slowly became clear. "Please help me." The words formed again and again. "Please help me." Emma tugged at James's sleeve. "Daddy, what's that lady doing?" James knelt down beside his daughters, his heart already beginning to understand what his mind was still processing. "She's asking for help, sweetie," he said softly. Sarah, always the curious one, walked closer to the woman. "Why doesn't she just talk?" "Because she can't hear or speak, honey," James explained gently. "She uses her hands to communicate." The woman noticed them watching. Her hands stilled for a moment, and then she raised them again, signing with slow, deliberate movements. James concentrated, pulling fragments of memory from deep within. "I has lost in everything, no his home, not his family, please his help." Something cracked open in James's chest. He saw the wheelchair, the thin coat, the way her shoulders trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Fear, loneliness, the kind of desperation that comes when you've been invisible for too long. Most people had walked past her that evening. They had places to be, warm homes to return to, problems of their own. It was easy to look away, to convince yourself that someone else would help, that there were systems in place for people in need. But James couldn't look away. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When he was close enough, he raised his hands and signed, clumsily but earnestly, "My name, James, what?" "Your name?" The woman's eyes widened. Tears began to form at their corners. It had probably been hours, maybe days, since anyone had actually communicated with her directly. Her hands moved, spelling out letters. "M-I-A. Mia," James said aloud, and she nodded. His daughters watched with wide eyes as their father continued the halting conversation with his hands. "You need food? Warm place?" Mia nodded vigorously, the tears now streaming down her cheeks. Her hands moved faster. "Tired money knows a place can sleep, very cold." James felt his heart sink. Here was a young woman, vulnerable in so many ways, alone in the winter cold. What kind of world allows this? He thought. But he already knew the answer. The world doesn't allow it or prevent it. It simply moves on, unless someone chooses to stop. He made a decision that would change everything. "Come," he signed, gesturing toward the direction of his apartment. "We help you." Mia's hands flew up in surprise, then hesitation. No, cannot take charity." But James shook his head firmly. He signed again, slower this time, making sure she understood every word. "Not a charity. Help people. Help people." For a long moment, Mia just stared at him. Sarah and Emma stood quietly beside their father, somehow understanding the weight of the moment, even at their young age. The snow continued to fall and the city sounds faded into a distant hum. Finally, Mia nodded. The apartment wasn't much. a modest two-bedroom, place with worn furniture and children's drawings taped to the walls. But it was warm and it was safe, and right now that was everything. James helped Mia inside while his daughters rushed ahead, already chattering about their unexpected guest. He made hot chocolate for everyone and found his late wife's warmest sweater for Mia to wear. As she wrapped her hands around the steaming mug, James noticed her eyes taking in the small apartment, the photos on the mantel, the toys scattered across the floor, the gentle chaos of a home filled with love. Over the next few hours, using a combination of sign language, writing, and his phone's translation app, James learned Mia's story. She had been born deaf, raised in a small town in Vermont. Her parents had died in a car accident. 3 years ago, the same accident that had left her paralyzed from the waist down. She had spent time in and out of rehabilitation centers, but without family or financial support, she had eventually ended up on the streets. The systems meant to help had failed her, one after another: lost paperwork, missed appointments, shelters with no wheelchair access. She had been alone for 8 months, living in her wheelchair, depending on the kindness of strangers who rarely stopped long enough to understand her situation. "But you're so young," James wrote, showing her his phone. "There must be services, programs that can help." Mia's response was simple and heartbreaking. Get help. When? No one understand you." That night, after Sarah and Emma had gone to bed, James sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open. He researched disability services, housing programs, and organizations that helped deaf individuals. He made lists, sent emails, and filled out forms. It was nearly 2 in the morning when he finally closed his computer. Mia had fallen asleep on the couch, wrapped in a warm blanket, a peaceful expression on her face that probably hadn't been there in months. James looked at her for a moment, thinking about his own daughters, sleeping soundly in their beds. What if it had been Sarah or Emma in that wheelchair, alone and unable to ask for help? The thought made his throat tighten. He knew he couldn't solve everything. He knew his own resources were limited, but he also knew he couldn't walk away. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. James contacted every organization he could find. He discovered a local non-profit that specialized in helping deaf and disabled individuals find housing. He connected with a social worker who had experience navigating the complex web of disability benefits. He even reached out to a lawyer friend who agreed to help with Mia's case pro bono. But more than that, he made sure Mia knew she wasn't alone. Sarah and Emma took to Mia immediately. They learned simple signs. "Hello, thank you, friend." Emma would sit beside Mia's wheelchair for hours, showing her drawings and toys, communicating in the universal language of kindness that children seem to understand instinctively. Mia helped where she could. She folded laundry, helped Sarah with her homework using written notes, and even taught all of them more sign language. The apartment filled with a new kind of communication, hands moving through the air, patient smiles, and the understanding that sometimes words aren't necessary to say the most important things. 3 weeks passed. The social worker, a determined woman named Patricia, worked tirelessly on Mia's behalf. Together with James's information and advocacy, they managed to secure emergency housing benefits. But even more importantly, they found Mia a spot in a specialized assisted living community designed for deaf and disabled young adults, a place where she would have her own apartment, access to interpreters, and a community of people who understood her unique challenges. The day came when it was time for Mia to move into her new home. James drove her there himself, with Sarah and Emma in the back seat. The building was modern and accessible, with ramps and visual alert systems. A staff member who was fluent in sign language greeted them warmly at the entrance. Mia's new apartment was small but beautiful. It had wide doorways for her wheelchair, a kitchen with lowered counters, and a large window that overlooked a small park. It was hers, truly hers, for the first time in 3 years. As the staff member showed them around, Mia kept looking at James with an expression he couldn't quite read. When they were finally alone for a moment, she pulled out her phone and typed a message. "Why did you help me? You didn't know me. You had your own problems. Why did you stop?" James thought for a moment before responding. He typed carefully, "Because someone needed help and I was there to give it. That's all. That's enough." But Mia shook her head and typed again. "Most people, they don't stop. They don't see. You saw me." James felt the weight of those words. "Everyone deserves to be seen," he typed back. "Everyone deserves kindness." Mia's hands moved then, signing with tears in her eyes. Her movements were clear and deliberate, and even James, with his imperfect knowledge, understood perfectly. "You saved my life." 6 months later, on a warm June evening, James received a video call request on his phone. When he answered, Mia's smiling face filled the screen. She was sitting in what looked like a bright, cheerful office. Using sign language with her camera on, she showed him around. She had gotten a job, a part-time position at the assisted living facility, helping with administrative work and serving as a peer mentor for other residents. But more than that, she looked happy. Truly happy. She typed a message and held it up to the camera. "Starting online classes in the fall. Social work degree. Want to help people like me." James felt his eyes sting with tears. Sarah and Emma crowded around the phone, waving enthusiastically at Mia and signing their hellos with the fluency they'd developed over the months of friendship. Later that night, after his daughters were asleep, James stood at his window, looking out at the city lights. He thought about that December evening, the snow falling softly, and a young woman in a wheelchair signing a desperate plea into the cold air. He thought about how easy it would have been to walk past, to convince himself it wasn't his responsibility, that he had enough to worry about with his own 2 daughters. But he had stopped. He had seen. He had helped. And in doing so, he had discovered something profound. That helping others doesn't diminish us, it expands us. It teaches our children what it means to be human. It reminds us that we're all connected, that compassion isn't a luxury but a necessity, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. Mia had signed that he saved her life, but in truth, she had saved something in him too, a belief in goodness, in community, in the simple but revolutionary idea that we're supposed to take care of each other. The city outside his window continued its endless movement, thousands of people, each with their own struggles and joys, their own silent pleas and answered prayers. And somewhere in that city, a young woman who had once been invisible was building a new life, not because the system had finally worked, but because one person had stopped long enough to see her, to understand her, and to help. That's all it takes sometimes. Just one person who decides to stop. Just one person who chooses to help. Just one person who remembers that we're all in this together. And that kindness, real, actionable, inconvenient kindness, is what makes us human. The snow had melted months ago, but the warmth of that December evening remained. A reminder that even in the coldest times, even when we feel most alone, there are still people who will stop. There are still people who will see. There are still people who will help. And sometimes that makes all the difference in the world.